All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the TPS for Ukrainians information session. As we begin, I just want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. It's also being live streamed on YouTube and will be posted on UCF Global's YouTube channel following the event today. So for those who weren't able to attend in person can watch after the event, and also you can refer back to it if needed. Thank you so much for attending. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge what a difficult 2 weeks it has been watching everything unfold in Ukraine. We want to say that we stand with the Ukrainian people, and our thoughts are with you during these really difficult times. And we hope that this information session can be helpful to get information out about temporary protected status. So my name is Christina Khan. I'm the director at UCF Global at the University of Central Florida. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm joined with attorney Nayef Mubarak, who will introduce in just a moment. So in today's information session, we're going to cover several topics about temporary protected status. First, we're going to talk about what is TPS, what are the requirements of TPS and the benefits, how do you apply? And then we'll also get to a lot of pre-submitted questions. So thank you to everyone who sent questions in advance. We have incorporated all of those questions into the presentation and the FAQ section at the end. So thank you so much for sending those over. For those who aren't familiar with UCF Global at the University of Central Florida, our mission is to transform lives by providing access to high impact international experiences across UCF and the global community with a commitment to excellence in service, partnership, and innovation. Within UCF Global, we offer many English programs for those who are interested in learning English and perhaps moving on to a degree program, or just learning English for your own career advancement. We also have International Student and Scholar Services, which is the office that supports all of the students and researchers who are at UCF studying or conducting research. And also we work with to recruit international students as well as form partnerships with universities and institutions across the world. If you would like to learn more, please visit our website at global.ucf.edu. And as we get started, I also want to draw your attention to an upcoming event that might be of use to you or your communities. So Fragaman, which is a very large law firm, immigration law firm in the United States, is going to be hosting a webinar specifically discussing options for Ukrainians who are not in the United States. So the details of this are still being worked out, but it's planned for March 23rd at 1 p.m. You'll be able to get a link and all of the details at Fragaman's website at fragaman.com. So I encourage you to attend if that would be useful or of help for you. Now it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce attorney Nayef Mubarak. Nayef is an incredible partner and very involved in the local community here in Orlando. He was the former chair of the Orange County Bar Association and the former Orlando regional vice chair of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He's also a current board member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, of Central Florida, as well as a UCF alumnus. He does a lot in the community and really does so much to support the immigrant community, especially here in Central Florida. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Attorney Mubarak. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning to everybody. And thank you to UCF Global for putting this on such short notice. As Ms. Khan mentioned, it's been an incredibly difficult 2 weeks to watch things unfold, and with leaders like UCF in our community who are putting this on not just for their students, but sharing it with other universities. And hopefully future other seminars can continue to help. But just thank you for taking the initiative and the leadership. I'm happy to be here. I do want to remind everybody again, this is a live streamed and shared recording. Please do not ask any questions or share confidential information. When you get to the question and answer session, this is not going to be any kind of confidential or legal advice. So please, this is just general information, and we ask everybody to use this to kind of help educate themselves and their community. Okay, so what is temporary protected status? The Department of Homeland Security can designate a foreign country for TPS. When a particular country is stricken with war or natural disaster or some type of situation that would not be safe for their citizens that are here in the US to return, the DHS can issue TPS. And so let's talk about what does it mean, who's eligible, and what are some of the benefits for it. Okay, so as we mentioned, the Secretary of Homeland Security usually consults with the other agencies, and they are pretty much determining whether or not this is something that is going to designate for its citizens. Now, if you are also a national or a person who's stateless, you may also be eligible for TPS, which we're going to talk about that on the next slide here. So current countries, the list is getting pretty long given the kind of turmoil that we're seeing in today's world. Last year, we saw that Venezuela was added to the list. We saw a redesignation for Haiti and Syria and South Sudan. Redesignation basically allowing for new people to enroll in this program and register for the benefits of TPS and the protection of TPS, which we're also going to discuss. So even if you're not Ukrainian or you know somebody who might be from one of these countries, this video is going to be pretty general enough that would allow for others to benefit from this information. So feel free to go ahead and share that. Okay, so as far as TPS in Ukraine, right? How do you qualify? Who can qualify? These are some of the very basic requirements. Now, UCF Global did a fantastic job putting this seminar on together for all of you, to the point where we do not have the full regulations and instructions from USCIS as of yet. It was announced last week. We got together as a community and we put this on, but we're still waiting for particular details to be released from USCIS. But from what we do know, you must be a Ukrainian national or stateless person residing in the Ukraine. So let's say the last country you were living prior to the United States was the Ukraine, but you are a person of no other nationality. Palestinians, for example, are often given the designation as stateless, but the last place you resided was in the Ukraine. This is to help protect those who are refugees, who their last home was in fact a particular place designated for TPS, and it's not safe for them to return to that place either. Continuous residence since March 1st, 2022, meaning you have to have established your ties of living in the United States as of this date. And there's also a physical presence requirement. So typically we are often asked, and you'll see in the questions, what happens if I was abroad? Or what happens if I wasn't here on this particular day? Can I still qualify for TPS? Now, the registration period, this final prong, is usually issued for 6 months after the announcement. We've seen longer registration periods for countries like Venezuela, but typically it's usually 6 months. And this registration period typically has a hard start and end date. And it's really critical that if you're going to pursue TPS, you file within these dates that will be announced. And we promise, I'm sure UCF, and I know that my firm will share this information when it's released from USCIS, but for now, we'll be on the lookout for these particular details. So I briefly touched on a stateless person and what it means here as far as TPS status is, but we do see this other question a lot here, this prong and this hypothetical. What if you entered on a different passport other than your Ukrainian passport? What if you happen to be a dual citizen of Italy and Ukraine and you entered on your F1 visa, which was issued on your Italian passport? Does that mean you are no longer eligible for TPS? No, that's not true. We have to prove that you resided and your ties were in Ukraine, that you were not resettled anywhere else. A big example of this with Venezuela, there's over 400,000 individuals who have sought TPS protection. Many of them are dual nationals, either from Italy, Spain, wherever it may be. But oftentimes this nationality was given to them through an ancestor, a grandfather, or grandmother, for example, but they never lived, they never resided or worked in that country. So we are still going to pursue TPS applications for them as Venezuelan nationals. And the same can be done with Ukraine. And we've actually had several approvals for Venezuelans with that dual nationality. So don't let that deter you if you entered on a different passport. So a lot of times people are going to ask us, well, how do I prove these requirements? Like, what do I need to qualify? Is it just my words? Is it just an application? Well, it's a combination of both, right? We definitely want to document the eligibility, and especially if you're a clear-cut person who qualifies. And what I mean by that is, hypothetically, you're a Ukrainian citizen, you entered in 2020, and you've been studying here consistently and you've never left. It's going to be pretty obviously through your school transcripts, your travel departure records, that you qualify for this. But sometimes people don't have certain things. If they're living with a family member and they don't have a lease, for example, you're staying at your cousin's house or your uncle's house, how do I prove that I've been here if I don't have a lease and I don't make any payments? We can use things like affidavits or sworn statements, again, your attendance in the records, and if you have any financial transactions. It's a pretty creative way of being able to document these things. So we briefly touched on, what if there's a break in continuous residence? What if you departed? What if you were not here on March 1st, or whatever the physical presence date may be? Regardless, there is an exception in certain situations if the trip was brief, casual, and innocent. So what do these words mean? Like, why don't they just give us something a little bit more black and white? Basically, they're going to see, well, how long were your ties here in this country prior to your departure? How long were you gone for? What was the purpose of this visit? For example, if you took a 4-day cruise to Mexico on the weekend of this announcement, is that something that's going to be considered brief, casual, and innocent? Oftentimes, if we see a trip that's less than 90 days, we believe there's a strong cause or of support to make this argument. So even if you did have a trip that was during this time, or maybe a couple of weeks before, you're worried about that break in continuous residence, we do suggest that you meet with an immigration attorney to kind of go over and kind of discuss what kind of evidence you'll need in that situation. So at that point, the situation gets a little bit more complicated as far as proving your continuous residence, maybe an affidavit as to why you were traveling, and proof that it was just perhaps a short cruise and you were not resigning from your post at UCF, for example. So this is super important. And this is what I'll harp on a lot when we start to talk about, what about my student visa? What about my work permit? What should I do? How do I register? So as I mentioned, the registration period is very strict. So whenever those dates are provided to us, if you do not register for TPS within those parameters, it could be lost to you forever. So an example of that, when the earthquake in Haiti happened over 10 years ago, there was a short time to register, and then it was extended one time. But after that, if you did not register within that first year or so, TPS was lost for you forever. And TPS has continued to be renewed for several years. So you can imagine people who thought maybe that they don't want to do this, had they only registered, this benefit would remain available to them for the future. Now, again, we're still waiting for the details on the registration. USCIS.gov has a lot of resources for each individual country, talking about the requirements and the forms. So when that's released, you can check there. And I will give a little public service announcement. Be careful of notarios, not licensed attorneys, or people portraying themselves as attorneys saying, hey, hire me now, pay me now, because we're going to file for TPS for you. Well, the rules haven't been released, so everybody should kind of slow down a little bit until that comes out. So don't pay for the forms. The forms are free on the website. So just be sure to be on the lookout for that information as it comes. And as I mentioned, UCF will share it. If you follow me on social media, we do lives every week. We do updates on the newsletters. So just check it out. And we promise to try to keep our community as informed as possible. So what are some of the benefits? Why is it something we really want to talk about? Why is it something that people should truly consider? Well, for a big one for students is the work authorization, right? Being able to work and being able to support yourself. Now, let's think about, in addition to not being able to go home in Ukraine, many Ukrainians are probably facing financial hardships, right? Maybe their family can no longer support them. Perhaps the currency issue is really affecting them. So how is this individual going to support themselves? So that's a really great benefit. Now, we will touch on this again when we're maintaining your F1 status. So I'll put a warning out there. Just because you have a work authorization through TPS, it might not necessarily mean you should be working under your F1 status. And we will circle back to that. Advanced parole document. The advanced parole document allows for an individual to travel. So for example, I'm an F1 student and I need to travel at some point in time, but my visa on my passport has expired. I have a valid I-20. I'm very scared to go travel to a third-party country to get a new F1 visa. How can I do that and feel a little bit better about it? Well, having advanced parole on TPS might help an individual feel a little bit better about traveling to go renew their F1 visa, which is required for renewals of the visa abroad. And protection from removal. Now, we've been talking about students, and yes, this is UCF Global, but TPS is not limited to students. It's not limited to those in status. It could be available to anybody who meets the requirements of, are you a citizen, national, or stateless person? Do you meet these physical and continuous residence requirements? So if you have a pending asylum application, if you came here 9 years ago on a tourist visa and you overstayed, you could still be eligible for TPS. So this allows that protection from removal. Now, some of you might say, well, I want to continue with my asylum application. Why would I register for TPS? It's not as good. It's not as have the permanent benefits as asylum. Well, guess what? Asylum is very, very difficult to get. And if you lose your asylum case, you can end up with an order of removal. But they cannot remove you if you have TPS. So it's a really good safety net. And, as far as preserving status, once your TPS is granted, even if you graduate on your F1, I'm going to give that example a lot, you won't be required to leave. You're not going to be accumulating unlawful presence because your TPS is granted at that time. So it's kind of tolling the time, putting a pause on the time at which that TPS granted status was received. So it's a really good benefit. And for me, I can't harp on it enough that registration is really important. And whether or not you do work authorization or advanced parole, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. But these are some of the important benefits for TPS here. Excuse me. So TPS while holding another status. So this is the hot topic. People save this video. You're going to probably want to listen to this a few times if you're a student or maintaining another status. So the regulations are very clear that TPS does not affect one's ability to hold another non-immigrant status. So this means you can still keep your F1, you can keep your tourist visa, you can keep whatever non-immigrant status that you have and your TPS. So why are we talking about work permits and other things here? So I want to just jump to this. We kind of touched on lawful presence and asylum, but I do want to talk about international students and their work authorization. And so, yes, the regulations state that you can maintain both statuses, but it also states you must comply with the requirements of each status. So if you are an international student, you know that you cannot work without the authorization of your university. Without this, OPT or some kind of economic hardship status, you are not authorized to work. So the conflict would happen if you have a work authorization from TPS, but you don't have authorization under your F1 status. Now, I will say, the verdict or the opinions vary on this, right? It's saying, well, why would I not be allowed to work is one argument if they are telling me I can. And then the other side is, well, a strict reading of it is you have to meet the requirements for both to maintain both statuses. So all we have as far as guidance on this issue is like a frequently asked questions memo released from USCIS. I believe it's over 10 years ago, where they say, no, you cannot maintain your F1 status if you don't have work authorization, but you're working under TPS. You would violate your F1 status. Now, I believe UCF Global and maybe Fragment are going to kind of just err on the side of caution. Since it's a gray area and it's our job to protect you as much as possible, we are going to say you should not work on TPS if you are trying to maintain your F1 status and you don't have authorization to work through your F1 student status. Now, this may change. Hopefully there's more guidance, but for now, the guidance we have is over 10 years old and states that that's not possible. But the good thing about registering, and the previous slide we talked about the importance of registering, is let's say after your OPT, you are not a lucky individual who gets H-1B or who finds an employer. At that point in time, your F1 career more or less may be over. You may at that point decide, well, I want to work authorization through TPS. And at that point, you would be eligible for that work authorization simply because you registered within the proper time period. As far as asylum pending, just a quick note here. If you're seeking asylum and you have a work permit, these work permits are authorized and valid for 2-year periods. And your first work permit through asylum is free. It's not the case with TPS. TPS work permits are for 18 months and you pay the fee. So again, if you have a pending asylum and a work authorization for there, perhaps work permit is not necessary through TPS, but the registration would be. I hope that makes sense for everybody, and I hope I explained it clearly. Christina, is there anything you want to clarify with that?
No, I think you've covered it, and I think we'll get into it in more detail as we go on, even in the questions as well.
Okay, great. So we can go on to the next slide. All right, so how do we apply? So as we mentioned, the USCIS has not given us instructions on where to apply or what are the dates, but basically we know that this will be the procedure. Form I-821 is used for temporary protected status. The 765 is the work authorization. And then if you wanted e-notifications. And if you see on the bottom, the filing fees, it gets expensive if you're doing the work permit. There's a typo there, I missed it. It's 765, but if you see on the top, it's correct. But you're also eligible for the the travel advance parole document, right? And that's $575 additional dollars. But if you're just registering, that's $135 for TPS. And really quick on the other screen, and no, we can leave it here, but avoid the immigration scams. We touched on this. The forms are free. Nobody should be charging you for the forms. Even USCIS is really updating their website where they're allowing for individuals to do e-filing for TPS applications. They slowly started to roll it out with certain countries. I believe most of the countries now are eligible for electronic filing on USCIS for TPS. So just be on the lookout for that when it comes, and avoid immigration scams. Avoid people taking money from you today or any kind of false promises. You need to really be careful. Having somebody tell you something and you signing it at the end of the day, you're still swearing under oath that something is true. So please be careful and make sure you read any of the forms that are not prepared by you, because you are authorizing those statements are truthful and correct. And ignorance of the law is not going to protect you down the road. So please be very mindful of any scams or things like that. Okay, so I'm gonna let Christina talk for a little bit and then or at least read some questions, and we'll go into that next.
All right, thank you so much, Attorney Mubarak. So now we're gonna head into the pre-submitted questions, and we're just gonna rapid fire go through them one by one. So let's start with the first question, and that is, can I apply for TPS if I am still in Ukraine and will return back to the USA later?
This is a really good question. and we want to verify some depends, right? A very legal answer is it depends. What was your status before March 1st? Were you ever in the United States? What kind of residence ties do you have here? How long have you been in the Ukraine? If you at that point in time you were in the Ukraine for 6 months post-graduation as an F1, it might be hard to argue that your trip is brief, casual, and innocent. If you happen to be there for 1 week, then you know, but when we have that you've been here for 3 years and you've already registered for your summer school term, then perhaps we can make that argument. So it really depends as to our analysis is this trip brief, casual, and innocent? And do you meet the other requirements for TPS?
Great, and I do see some questions coming into the chat. I'm going to hold on those. I think many of these are going to be answered in the other questions that we have already received and submitted. But if we don't answer those, then we'll go to the chat at the end. All right, so next question. Can the person on TPS bring their family to the United States?
Unfortunately, TPS is not like a grant of asylum. I'm going to just say a hard no on this. It does not help. There's no petition to be filed if you were granted for TPS. So unfortunately, that's not an option.
What are the disadvantages of TPS?
So I saw this question and, again, I'm going to give the lawyer answer on, and it depends, right? So everybody has personal situations and goals and goals to achieve that might be vary from one person to the other. So if you're here out of status and you have no option and you have no work permit and you have no protection from deportation or removal, I'm not sure what any disadvantage, if any, might be of TPS. Now, if you're somebody who really does not plan to remain in the US and you would like to obtain some kind of other non-immigrant visa later, there's a lot of people out there on the internet blogs telling you that this is going to affect your tourist visa in the future. This might affect your family's tourist visa in the future. I don't take that stance if you've maintained your status and you were not out of status prior to that. I think it all depends on your actions moving forward. So I can't think of what disadvantages may be. That's going to really depend on what is a person's long-term goals, what's their status, what options do they even have available to them.
Can TPS be extended if war continues?
Absolutely. So it's not going to be up to you to extend it. It's for an 18-month initial period. Typically, a few months before that period ends, there will be an extension of TPS authorization by the Secretary of Homeland Security. So, and we've seen this all the time. As I mentioned, Haitian TPS has been around for over 10 years. There's some for even longer. If the situation does not get better, if the situation is not safe, then absolutely, DHS can extend that, in which you would have to file an extension.
Can the person on TPS visit another country without a risk of not being allowed to come back?
Sure. So I'm going to answer this question in two parts. First, TPS allows for travel so long as you seek that advance parole document. That document is filed on Form I-131. It costs $575. You have to ask for the permission and you cannot travel until you receive that document. So TPS does not, there's no ban on Ukrainians. If you have a valid visa, you can continue to travel in and out. But just because you have an advance parole document and you don't have possibly a valid F1 visa, you might not be readmitted as an F1, but as a parolee, right? Or on your TPS status. So again, that balancing act, we have to kind of verify with an attorney or somebody who is authorized to give you guidance on that. But short answer is yes, you can travel so long as you have the advance parole document.
Do documents submitted with a TPS application need to be officially translated into English?
Yes. So USCIS is very clear that any document submitted with any application must be translated. Now, there's questions as far who has to authenticate the translation. Typically, it doesn't have to go through an embassy or consulate or some kind of approved translation source, but there must be a certificate of translation where the person is swearing and attesting that they are both fluent in Ukraine in the language the document is being translated from to English, and they have provided a certificate of translation.
I know the next couple of questions are going to refer specifically to F1 visa, F1 students. Okay. So does applying for TPS cause me to lose my F1 student visa?
No, right? Not by itself, right? Even if you apply for TPS and you apply for a work permit and you don't work with that work permit, you're not going to lose your F1 status, okay? If, big if, you maintain the requirements of your F1 status. Getting a grant of TPS and then you drop out of your classes, guess what? You're not maintaining your F1 status anymore. You're not maintaining that part of the bargain that you said you would. So, and it's very clear, the regulations, and we mentioned that earlier, that you can maintain your non-immigrant status and your TPS status. It's our position that you have to follow the requirements for both. So that's where the gray area as working under TPS without authorization under F1 comes from. And all we have is guidance from 10 plus years ago.
Should F1 students maintain their status while applying for TPS or while on approved TPS?
So again, this depends on you. Do you want to continue your studies? Do you want to maintain that non-immigrant status? Or do you feel the need to stop attending school and support your family back home with the understanding that by not maintaining your F1 requirements, you're going to lose that F1 status, right? So it's completely up to the individual as to what their personal situation is and what their long-term goals are.
Will TPS affect my F1 optional practical training OPT or curricular practical training CPT?
No. With TPS Venezuela, we saw this question a lot. They'll ask me, well, why should I get a work permit if I have work authorization through OPT? I'll tell them you don't have to, right? Just register for TPS. And if something down the line does not come in your favor through OPT or H-1B, because you registered during the requisite time, you will have that ability to get a work permit later down the road. So again, similar to having an F1 status, and OPT is not going to be affected by simply registering for TPS.
We have a lot more questions and we'll keep them coming if that's all right.
All right, I'm gonna have some water.
All right, the next question is also about F1 students. So what if my F1 expires, but I'm still a student and I'm unable to renew the visa in Ukraine?
Okay, so we want to first clarify what is an F1 status and what is an F1 visa, right? The F1 visa is on your passport, and this allows you to enter our country, leave and return and go through our borders with this visa. Now, the authorization typically for F1 student is based on your I-20. Sometimes a duration of status is given. So because let's say you're here on a 4-year program with UCF Global and you have 2 years left, but your visa expires, you're not going to be prevented from continuing your studies just because the document on your passport has expired. What's going to control your authorization inside the US is your I-20 and your I-94. If you need to travel internationally, that's when it becomes problematic for the individual because they cannot return unless the visa has been extended in their passport. So as logistical approach, what happens if there's no way to go to Ukraine? Can I do it through another consulate? Can I go to another US embassy? Yes, right? It's a matter of what's called third-party consular processing, making an appointment at that particular consulate, and then returning. Now, again, if you have TPS and you're doing it, then we would recommend doing the advanced parole document, another security net. But I just want to clarify, and to that particular question, if you're here, you have a valid I-20, you have a valid I-94, you're maintaining your F1 requirements, just because the visa in your passport expires, you're not required to leave. You can continue studying. If you need to travel internationally, then yes, you'll need to do a third-party consular processing.
And I would just add that if students have any questions about their status or about the validity of their I-20 or maybe needing an I-20 extension, to talk with your international student advisor at your school. So at UCF, come to UCF Global, we're happy to help you out. But if you're attending a different school and you're on the call today, you'll want to check with the international office and they'll be able to guide you. So next question. I'm an F1 student on optional practical training, OPT. Is it recommended for me to apply for TPS?
I think we kind of touched on this on the previous thing. I would say yes, register. You don't need to do the work permit unless you don't want to. But a lot of students on OPT, from my understanding, their goal is H-1B, perm, maybe even an EB-2 NIW, self-petition. There's a lot of different things out there. But if none of these things pan out and you don't want to go back and TPS is still available, as long as you registered, you can get your work authorization down the road. So I would say just register.
And what happens to my F1 status when TPS expires?
So let's say there's good news and bad news. If TPS is not renewed, that means hopefully the situation in Ukraine has resolved. Bad news is TPS is not extended, right? So what happens? Well, it depends. Did you maintain your F1 status? So did you continue to go to your courses? Did you work without authorization from your F1, but through TPS? So you're going to revert, when TPS, that protection is gone, you're left with the status that you've maintained. Again, this might fall into the gray area as did violating your work permit, violating your status with your work permit, violate or not. The people who are on the more aggressive approach as to you can do both without permission from the other will argue that you can revert back to your F1 status if we are, if USCIS sticks to their policy as to what we saw from over 10 years ago, then they were going to say you would have violated that status.
Should we apply for TPS if we are graduating and already applied for or received OPT?
Same answer as just register. That's what would be my recommendation.
I am an F1 student. If I am granted TPS and use the employment authorization from TPS, can I still keep F1 status?
This comes back to that kind of area we talked about a few times. We have guidance from USCIS that says you cannot work and keep F1 unless you have authorization under F1, even if you have an authorization under TPS. So again, some people might argue that point differently, but our conservative approach is you need authorization under both statuses to preserve both statuses.
Okay, if I am granted TPS and kind of along the same lines, do I have to continue maintaining my F1 status?
Again, this is going to be a personal question as to what's your long-term goals. But legally speaking, as far as remaining in the US, no, you don't have to continue the F1. The TPS is there to tell you, like, even if you fall out of status, you could stay here under TPS, understanding that the TPS is not a permanent status. It does not have a pathway to permanent residency, and there's not guaranteed there will be extensions.
I'm an international student. If I am granted TPS, do I become eligible for in-state tuition? So I think I'll take this one.
Christina question, yes.
Not automatically. Typically, I'll just speak for UCF. I think for those who are attending from other schools, you'll definitely want to talk with, start with your international office or the financial aid office in your university to learn more. But at UCF, there's a whole process to determine residency for tuition purposes. And generally, no, just changing to TPS does not make you automatically eligible for in-state tuition. Can someone who has a pending asylum application apply for TPS?
Absolutely. I would, that's a question about the work permit, but absolutely register even if you have a pending asylum.
If I have employment authorization from my pending asylum application, do I need to apply for an employment authorization document through TPS?
No, registration would suffice for you. You could continue to renew your work authorization through your asylum. In the unfortunate event, if your asylum is ever denied or withdrawn, you could at that point pursue work authorization through TPS, assuming that TPS is still authorized for your country.
All right. Can J1 exchange visitors apply for TPS and also J2 dependents?
Yeah, so TPS does not have any limits on it, who can apply as far as what type of visa it is. Now, I did mention if you're out of status, you can seek it. If you entered the country, undocumented, you can still seek TPS. Dependents, I would say yes, but I do want to say I have seen situations where a dependent might not be a citizen of Ukraine, might have never lived in Ukraine, maybe was born in Chile, and then they'll say, well, what is my kid going to do? Well, unfortunately, we cannot register somebody who doesn't meet the black and white requirements.
Can individuals with TPS apply for a green card?
No, as the law stands now, there is no path to residency through TPS alone. However, if one was to marry a U.S. citizen or is eligible through an employment authorization category, it's not going to prevent you as long as you meet the other eligibility requirements. There has been proposals for immigration reform, part of the DREAM Act, to include TPS in there. But as of now, TPS alone definitely will not lead you to a permanent residency status.
So I think you've kind of talked about this, but what happens when the 18 months of TPS end?
When the 18 months ends for TPS, it's going to be up to the DHS secretary to determine whether or not there needs to be an additional extension of 18 months. And if so, then everybody would be eligible to seek a renewal. Now, if you never registered for the 6 months and now you're like, crap, I would like to register now. Can I do that? It depends. It must be redesignated. A simple extension of the program will not allow for new registrants. You would have to look for the wording of redesignation. It's like as if they're opening it from anew.
Can I register for TPS now and apply for employment authorization later?
Absolutely.
And how long is the TPS processing time?
So that varies. I have no real solid answer for you. I can tell you that the largest group of individuals was over 400,000 was Venezuela last year. And we saw people as fast as 3 months. And then I still have people who are still pending, who are over at 10 months at this point in time. So that's not a clear answer for that, but we'll have to wait and see.
I'm in the US, but my spouse is not. Can I include my spouse in my application for TPS?
Your spouse, every applicant for TPS must meet the individual requirements. Unfortunately, there's not like an umbrella or family derivative option through that.
Can TPS be a reason to deny permanent residency in the future?
I don't see why not. Here, like as I mentioned, if you have a grant of TPS and you eventually marry a U.S. citizen, you can adjust status here. It might get a little bit more complicated if you have TPS, you fell out of student status, and then you're married to an LPR, permanent resident. Typically, you cannot adjust from an LPR status. If you are out of status, like that's getting very complicated. But, a TPS alone is not a bar to getting a permanent residency status, so long as you meet the requirements for that permanent residency application you are pursuing.
Is there a quota on the number of people who can get TPS?
Nope, just the requirements. And I think they said there might be over 300,000 people in the US who might be eligible for this. So we're going to see like another huge influx. I mean, this is significantly large numbers compared to other places like Syria or Haiti as to the number of individuals who have that status.
If I apply for TPS while I am in asylum process, do I need to file for the work permit?
Say that's asked and answered. No, that's up to you. You don't need to. You can continue to renew through your asylum application.
Just a few more. I am out of status. Can I apply for TPS?
Absolutely. So you came here on a tourist visa. You came here on an F1. You came here 15 years ago. If you've never left, but you meet all the other requirements, you absolutely can apply for TPS. I mean, if there's one of the largest group of people who are going to benefit from this is going to be these individuals who haven't been able to get driver's license, work authorization, any type of identity documents to kind of live here. This is going to make, pretty life-changing for many of you. So absolutely, if you're out of status, so long as you meet the requirements, can you apply for TPS?
Can I apply for TPS myself, or do I need an attorney?
Many people do it by themselves. Absolutely. If you have trips, if you have dual nationality, criminal history, there's certain things that complicate the factors there, where you would want the advice of an attorney to go through it. But for very, black and white cases, people who are savvy might be able to do it. I'm not the type of attorney who tells you that you need an attorney to do so. In fact, with the international students, I tell them all the time, just go to your institution, they'll walk you through it, or sometimes if you're a black and white clear citizenship applicant, you could do that by yourself. But really, that's going to be preference to an individual. There are inadmissibility issues if you have criminal history or any type of other problems that might pop up. So we didn't really talk about that, that it prevents you from being eligible for TPS. So please be sure to whoever you discuss your TPS application with, to disclose everything to them, to make sure you're not going to put yourself in the situation of losing money for application fees, then in possibly removal proceedings because you're not eligible for TPS in the first place, but you've now put yourself to the forefront.
How can I get in contact with Attorney Mubarak?
Well, our website is mubaraklaw.com. We do a Facebook Live almost weekly on Instagram and Facebook. Our phone number is 407-502-3000. Oh, thank you. We speak Spanish, Urdu, Arabic. We also have French and Creole in our office. So we're happy to help. Tomorrow, we're actually doing a Facebook Live with a very good friend of mine. You might have heard of her, Christina Khan. She's going to be talking about F1 and student visa options with me. So what happens after graduation? Maybe you're not Ukrainian. Maybe you want to know what are your options. If you have any friends that you'd like to share with, please join us. And then, for like next week, we might talk about EB5 or car accidents. So just on social media, we're pretty active on there, and we would appreciate any support through that as well.
Awesome. Well, I think there are a few questions in the chat that we didn't address in the pre-submitted questions. Is that okay if I go ahead and read those off?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Do they give TPS status to everyone who applies and meets the requirements?
Yeah, I think that question is similar to other quotas. If you meet the requirements, you will be eligible for TPS.
Okay. I'm just kind of going through. Some of these have been answered in different ways. Are there any work restrictions when working with a TPS EAD? Would some companies not hire you because of that specific status?
Most companies just want to see that you're I-9 compliant, that you have work authorization from the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, sometimes companies or employers with large government interactions like Lockheed Martin for security level clearances, maybe that might not be eligible, but most employers, I don't believe it's really an issue.
Is there any expedited processing for TPS?
So USCIS is kind of plagued with backlogs right now. We had COVID, we had TPS, there's all sorts of issues going on, changes in administrations. It's very difficult to get an expedite request. And you would have to show, severe financial loss, or medical hardships. It's not impossible, but I would say it's very difficult. And we definitely work with our clients often to do that. And we have been successful sometimes and sometimes not. So it really depends on the case by case basis.
All right. So when you have multiple family members applying for TPS, does everyone file a TPS application separately, or is there a group application?
No, unfortunately, no group applications.
Do you have any insight on what are the chances of getting approved for a fee waiver for TPS applications?
That's going to depend on the individual's circumstances. Like if you can prove the hardship or poverty guidelines, the registration is typically only $135. I would say to avoid delay, try to come up with that money. USCIS, even in many applications, will take credit cards. So, try to do your best, because what happens with the fee waiver is they are going to be processed, and it might take a month or two for a decision, or 3 months, and then you get a package denial rejection 3 months later, what could have been a pending application. So I always tell people, unless it's really not feasible by any means, do your best to try to come up with the fees.
And last one, can people who have TPS qualify for government assistance or programs such as Medicaid?
Typically, Medicaid and things like that is reserved to permanent residents and citizens. I'm not an expert by that by any means, so I'm just going to say I can't answer that question. But typically, government assistance programs, unless they are designed for everyone, are usually have some kind of certain requirements. So I unfortunately can't help you there.
And last one, I promise this time. We got another one that got sent to me. TPS advanced parole, can it be used for leisure, or must there be like an emergency or humanitarian travel?
I mean, typically they ask for what's the purpose, and I think it's a discretion application, meaning that it's up to the officer. It's not guaranteed simply by paying the fee that you'll receive it. So we tend to want to see some type of urgency or need to travel. I've never put on an application that I want to go on a cruise to the Bahamas. Please grant my application. So I think it may be wise to have something urgent, and it doesn't have to be, severe surgery. Maybe it's visiting a family member who's ill, right? Perhaps, or there's legal appointments that you must attend to, things like that.
Great. Well, that wraps up all of the questions. So I want to just re-emphasize that the information, once it's released by USCIS, you can find the specific details in the registration period that Attorney Mubarak mentioned at uscis.gov/TPS. So that would be a great place to check for the additional details in registration period. But with that, I really hope that this information was helpful to you all. Attorney Mubarak put some contact information in the chat, and it's also up here on the slide if you need to get in contact with his office for any type of assistance. But Attorney Mubarak, thank you so much for your time and answering all of these questions and for sharing information about TPS.
No, I'm loving the feedback, and Christina, thank you for the opportunity. We will promise to keep you guys updated. We're really active in our community, so if you feel like any churches or small communities would like a seminar, please just let us know. We believe knowledge is power, and we're here to help. And our prayers with everybody who's kind of stricken with war around the world, Ukraine and everybody else too. So hopefully we can get some peace around here soon.
Absolutely. I second that. So thank you everyone for attending. We hope that this was helpful, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.